few housekeeping items. I was going to say the session will be recorded. And so the recordings and the slides that we're going to go through here will be shared publicly with all of us following this session. In terms of an agenda, we will have a briefing around the pandemic fund, hearing some updates around there. We will have an opportunity for a Q&A. And so really encourage us to begin to put in our questions in the chat or to use the raise hand function so that we can get all the questions, maybe even as presentation is going forward. We are looking forward to having an interactive, participatory kind of conversation this morning. And then we'll be closing with key highlights on next steps on how to stay engaged. So welcome once again, and without further ado, I think we'll dive right into the presentation, the briefing on Pandemic Fund 101. I'll invite my colleague, Courtney from Stoppage and the Platform for Civil Society and Community Engagement on ACT-A, to take us through the slides on Pandemic Fund 101. Over to you, Courtney.
Great, thank you so much, Rosemary, and yeah, welcome everyone. As Rosemary mentioned, yeah, the aim of the session is to provide sort of a bit of background and a bit more information around sort of what is the Pandemic Fund 101. We come together with colleagues to sort of provide sort of regular updates on what's happening at the board, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but appreciating that when we do have those sessions, we kind of jump straight into the most kind of recent developments. So the aim of this session is to provide that kind of background information of like how we've got to where we are now. So wanted to provide a sort of overview of the development of the Pandemic Fund last year, a little bit around sort of structure and governance, the role of civil society throughout the development and also the governance of the Pandemic Fund so far, a little bit around funding, the first call for proposals and sort of priorities of the fund, and then close with sort of what's happening at the moment and next steps with the fund as well. So to start with, the Pandemic Fund was established last year and officially launched at a high-level event at the G20 in November 2022. It's one of a number of financial intermediary funds that are hosted by the World Bank, and it's set up to finance critical investments to strengthen pandemic prevention, preparedness and response capacities at a national, regional and global level, with a focus on low and middle income countries. Its aim is to bring the additional dedicated resources for pandemic prevention, preparedness and response to incentivize countries to increase investments and to enhance coordination amongst partners, as well as serving as a platform for advocacy. And we've included a link here, a very helpful link actually, that's on the World Bank website that has a sort of frequently asked questions page, which covers some of the information that we're going to be sharing today and some other questions again around sort of how it works, what's its structure, what's the role of WHO. So we can also add that link into the chat as well. So So looking at sort of why the fund was established, it was recognized that a dedicated fund would be needed to help fill the critical funding gaps in pandemic preparedness. The international health regulations and joint external evaluations look at sort of readiness to prevent, detect and respond to disease threats, but they haven't been sort of paired with structural support or sustained financing. And again, recognizing that many countries haven't prioritized preparedness investments, meaning sort of a real lack of investment in this area. And again, just want to highlight a briefing that's on this slide here from our colleagues at Pandemic Action Network that was issued last May around sort of the need for this new fund. And again, we'll share that link in the chat as well. And so in terms of sort of the development and yeah, where it all started in terms of this specific fund. The idea was sort of building on a call that was made from experts back in March 2020 for a global health security challenge fund, again, looking at sort of sustainable financing to close those gaps in health security capacity. And obviously in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was sort of support for this idea of a fund from spaces such as the G20 high-level independent panel on financing the global commons, as well as the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response. And so following that, in late 2021, G20 leaders established a joint health and finance task force to review proposals and recommend next steps to establish a fund. And then early in 2022, in April, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors reached consensus to establish the fund. And then in June, moving very quickly following that sort of consensus, a white paper was developed and published by the World Bank that was open for public input, sort of looking for feedback on kind of key areas that would sort of be kind of crucial to the fund. So looking at governance, looking at kind of overall structure, and looking at financing. And following that feedback and further development of a kind of concept of what the fund would look like, later that month in June, the World Bank Executive Board approved the new fund. As we said, that would be there to sort of fund these critical investments in pandemic preparedness and response. And so following the establishment of the fund, again, it's all moved a lot within 2022. So the first meeting of the governing board was held in September of last year, and we'll talk a little bit more around its structure and civil society representation there as well. In October, an open call was put out for the technical advisory panel that worked closely with the board. And again, we can come on to sort of what that now looks like. As I said, it was sort of formally launched by the G20 in November 2022. And those sort of governing board meetings following that first meeting in September have continued right until yesterday. There was a board meeting as well. And within that kind of governance structure, there have also been a number of working groups that have been established to work on sort of what the priorities of the fund will be, a results framework, co-financing policies, and moving towards a first call for proposals, which again, we'll talk a little bit more about later in the presentation. And yeah, looking kind of to now and forward, the technical advisory panel has actually been announced, I think within the last couple of days. And there has been sort of board discussions yesterday around first call for proposals, although that hasn't quite been launched yet. And looking further ahead, we're expecting a governing board reset. So that will sort of look at some of the seats, including the civil society seats, which are sort of interim roles at the minute, which again, we'll talk about. So the idea will be that they will move to kind of full-term representative roles during this sort of reset expected in May. And so then looking specifically at sort of civil society engagement in the process so far. So back in August 2022, as I said, everything moved very quickly last year with sort of the white papers and the kind of agreement to kind of like establish the fund in sort of June, July. In August, civil society coordinated by colleagues on this call, so Civic Action Network, ENASO, CISDI, Wacky Health, and the Platform for Acte Civil Society and Community Representatives hosted a number of information sessions between civil society and governments who are sort of going to be funding the fund to inform and shape the sort of design process, particularly also around sort of the governance structure, which kind of still needed that additional kind of work to establish what that would look like. The same civil society partners following, an ongoing process to secure civil society and community seats at the board. The same civil society partners then very rapidly managed a process to recruit and select interim civil society community board members for the fund. Noting that, again, we'll come to that, but they were interim roles, given that obviously everything did move very quickly. We needed to ensure representation, but that there was a need to kind of develop a longer term structure for that civil society community participation. As I've mentioned, the board meetings have been going on since September, and through that rapid process to identify interim representatives, it means our colleagues have been able to attend since September up until, again, yesterday's meeting. And in terms of sort of the civil society partners who have sort of hosted those information sessions and run the process, we've sort of created a sort of informal support team to the board members. And one of the key sort of pieces that we've been coordinating since sort of September is our sort of town hall meetings. So working with the board members to provide updates to broader civil society and communities on what is happening at the board, what decisions have been made, sort of what's the progress to date, and also providing opportunities for broader civil society and communities to input into those discussions through those spaces by sharing feedback and asking questions as well. We've also launched a Google group, which has been active again since September. Again, we'll share the link to sign up. We use that as a sort of constituency mailing list for the interim representatives to be able to share updates by email and to share notification, for example, of those town hall meetings as well. And then finally, in November, as I briefly mentioned, as well as sort of the governance board meeting since September, there's also been work to establish sort of working groups around the results framework, co-financing policies, and developing that first call for proposals. And so again, we've worked with the interim representatives to create a similar structure internally so that we have sort of support teams. I don't want to use the word working groups again, but support teams to work with the interim representatives to sort of rapidly review those documents and proposals that are being put forward in these 3 different working groups, again, to ensure that we're getting that broad feedback and input into those discussions and supporting the interim representatives to take that information forward within those working group meetings as well. Great. So yeah, that's a little bit around sort of how we've got to where we are in terms of the kind of timeline and process. In terms of the structure, again, from the World Bank website, they kind of like see it as having 4 essential kind of components. So obviously the governing board as the decision-making body of the fund that sets the overall work program and makes funding decisions. And we'll get into a bit more details of what that looks like. The Secretariat, responsible sort of for the admin functions, including support to the governing board in its sort of delivery responsibilities as that decision maker body. The Secretariat is housed by the World Bank and provides sort of project management, as I said, admin services, and yeah, supports the board very much in the role. There's also the financial trustee, which is served by the World Bank. And in addition, there are implementing entities to carry out the sort of pandemic funds work program at a country, regional and global level. And again, when we come to talk about the first call for proposals, we'll show a list of who those implementing entities are as well. And so then moving on to the governance structure. So as I already said, this is the decision-making kind of supreme governing body of the fund as it's described. There are 21 voting members with equal balance of sort of what are described as sort of contributors, so governments providing funding support to the fund, and co-investors, which are countries that could receive funding from this pandemic fund. There are also seats for, again, what are sort of described as non-sovereign contributors. So that includes foundations, and then 2 voting seats for civil society and communities as well. I'm not going to go through them all, but the 21 sort of voting members are all listed here on the screen. And again, highlights that kind of representation of governments contributing, governments eligible to receive foundations, as well as those civil society seats we'll go into as well. So, as I said, the process to identify civil society representatives was a rapid process last August, identifying 4 interim civil society representatives. I've included here our colleagues who are those taking on those representative roles since August, September, and are continuing at the moment. So Jacqueline, Elijah, Nitish, and Olia. As you'll see, we have a sort of global South board member, global North board member, and then an alternative board member for each of those sort of 2 constituency groups. And as I already mentioned, there is a sort of informal support team of the kind of civil society partners who ran that nomination process last year and organized the information sessions. And as I've already mentioned, some of that work that we're doing includes sort of supporting the board members in creating and convening sort of working groups or support teams on key areas of work, organising the town hall, and also, as I mentioned, the sort of constituency mailing list, so supporting the board members and making sure that information is shared more broadly. In addition, as I mentioned, in October, there was an open call for a technical advisory panel. This would be sort of core group of 20 experts across pandemic prevention, preparedness and response, to ensure that sort of the governing board is up to date with latest knowledge, and to provide advice on funding priorities, critical gaps, and funding allocation decisions as well. Mike Ryan at the World Health Organization is chair, and Joy St. John, executive director at the Caribbean Public Health Agency, is vice chair. The 20 members have I think been announced now. There is a website, although I think it may have been unavailable when we did try to share the link, but that is or will be shared very soon. And again, if it is up already this morning, then we'll share the link in the chat as well. And then sort of moving on from the governance, just to talk a little bit about financing, I think just important to note that to recognize that the fund will need $10.5 billion per year for its work. And the current pledges at the moment are 1.6 billion. Not all of those have been publicly announced. And actually the kind of longer term fundraising plan still isn't sort of confirmed. So it's kind of uncertain of what that's going to look like. But obviously, as you can see from the graph that colleagues have included here as well, like we can see that there is a huge funding gap. So that will obviously be a key area going forwards of what that kind of long-term fundraising does look like to support the fund. And so then sort of what the fund will do with that funding and how it will support governments. So there's sort of three key areas that are sort of thematic priorities for the fund. So that's strengthening country level pandemic capacity. So that includes surveillance, labs, emergency coordination and management, health workforce capacities, and also community engagement. There's also building regional and global capacity. And then finally, supporting technical assistance, analytics, learning, and convening as well. So those are the kind of broad kind of areas that the fund can would look to support. And at the minute, looking at sort of how that's operationalized, we are looking at the governing board sort of making a decision shortly around establishing and launching a first call for proposals. Our understanding, as I said, the board meeting was yesterday, so this is all sort of moving very fast and things change very quickly. But I think the aim was to be releasing the first call for proposals sort of very shortly, sort of into early next month. My understanding is that a decision's been made actually that before kind of formally launching the first call for proposals, and to give it a little bit more time to finalize that, an expression of interest will be launched possibly this week. And so that'll be kind of like the prep step before the kind of first call for announced. And so with this sort of first call for proposals, as I said, we're looking at about 4.6 billion that's sort of been pledged. This in this round, there will be up to $420 million available. The focus for this particular round, I appreciate, like, as I've said, like there's a broader kind of scope of thematic priorities, but they're looking at a particular focus for this kind of first round that would look at laboratory surveillance and health worker sort of workforce and HR. The process to apply will be sort of that applications need to be country-led with support of implementing entities. And just to say, we've listed here those kind of implementing entities, which, as I said, the World Bank see as one of the kind of four key components of the structure of the fund. And as you'll see here, they kind of cover sort of development banks, UNICEF, the World Bank itself, WHO, Gavi, Global Fund, and CEPI. And so, yeah, the applications will be country-led with support from these implementing entities. And sort of requirements for funding sort of expected to include obviously the need for co-investment and co-ownership, evidence of multi-stakeholder processes, including sort of civil society community participation as well. And the kind of eligible countries are those countries that are eligible to receive funding from the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and or IDA, as well as regional entities that are specialized technical institutions established by governments of one or more of these countries that are eligible for this type of funding. So as I said, moving because the board was yesterday, but expecting that that call for expressions of interest, which again will be shared once it's sort of public as well with colleagues. And then finally, just in kind of where we are in terms of the civil society engagement. Yeah, talked a lot around kind of where we're at in terms of sort of representation on the board with sort of interim representatives at the moment, and the kind of role that a number of our organizations on this call are kind of playing to provide that kind of support team behind the scenes. At the moment, we're developing a proposal for a long-term permanent civil society engagement structure, the Pandemic Fund. So we're looking at sort of best practice and kind of what we can learn from across the global health architecture and different agencies, sort of how do they within their organizations have a kind of civil society mechanism established at their governance board, and what does it look like in terms of what kind of support can be provided? So for example, financial support to support board members in their work to consult with and keep up to date much broader networks of civil society and communities. We often see agencies and sort of delegations having, a delegation to kind of support them, and also kind of a communications focal point to support, as well as obviously a lot of other financial support to support engagement and attendance at board meetings and committee meetings, for example. So we're looking at sort of, those best practices and lessons we can learn across the global health architecture, and also looking at how to, run a nomination process to identify the full-term representatives, recognizing that colleagues at the moment are interim representatives. Again, looking at building on the process that was run last year, again, recognizing it was done, and I say this with, I'm sure a number of colleagues on this call were involved in that. It was a very rapid process because everything moved so quickly. So I think there was sort of a week to kind of do that process. So now that we have more time, looking at, again, what can we learn from that process that was already done last year? What can we learn from, again, across the different agencies, across the global health architecture to run what is a sort of competitive, transparent, open nomination process? And also looking at within that kind of proposal as well, sort of how do we ensure that there's greater sort of information sharing and opportunities to provide updates to broader networks of civil society and communities. So as we've said here, sort of connecting kind of those kind of global governing kind of discussions within country and regional discussions as well, so that sort of representatives, as we've been doing through town halls, have an opportunity to connect much more broadly and to hear perspectives and questions that civil society would like to raise. This is an ongoing process. As I said, the board reset is expected in May, so we are very much sort of developing this. And again, I will put my email in the chat if anyone is interested in engaging in that process, which would like to share any perspectives on that kind of sort of longer term mechanism, or would just have any more questions about it. And I will stop there and hand back to Rosemary. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Courtney, for taking us through the update. For colleagues who joined us after we had started, a warm welcome once again, everyone, to this Pandemic Fund 101. We have just gone through a couple of slides looking at how we got where we are, how it is structured, and a few other things, including the first call for proposals and what's next for civil society and community engagement on the Pandemic Fund. And so I think we will be diving into the Q&A. And as we do that, for me, as Courtney was presenting, I couldn't help but to reflect on how rapid and how fast this process has been, and I think just appreciating the power of communities and civil society, because as the whole process was unfolding, it took community and civil society leadership to just come together to say that, look, we need civil society and community representatives, fighting for board seats, pushing on that, finally getting the two civil society and community seats on the board, and also just looking at how, as communities and civil society, we've managed to organize ourselves to ensure that there is strategic input. And so even as we have this conversation, I really appreciate everyone who has been part of this process. We appreciate our 4 community and civil society representatives on the board. It's not easy, but I think we really appreciate this kind of representation. And to the support team, the colleagues who have come together informally to support this process, a warm thank you and congratulations. So allow me to then transition us into the Q&A segment. I see we have hands up. I see people are utilizing the chat. And my colleague Olivia from CISDI will take us through the Q&A section. So really feel free, we encourage you to utilize this moment so we can engage. So Olivia, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great reflection, Rosemary, and thanks for the wonderful presentation, Courtney. So my name is Olivia from CISD. Greetings from Jakarta. I will moderate the Q&A session. So we will have around 35 to 40 minutes in total for the Q&A session, and we have colleagues from Platform for A, Courtney, and Rafa from PAN to help answer your questions or respond to your comments. So I invite colleagues to ask questions or to give comments or thoughts about the pandemic fund, or maybe sharing about the process happening in your country as well. Please do raise your hand and state your name, country, and affiliation if there's any. So I already see there's one hands up. Elia Baju, please, screen is yours.
Merci Olivia pour la parole. J'espère que vous m'écoutez.
I can hear you, Elia, please.
Ok, merci. Je vais intervenir en français pour que je sois un peu clair. Désolé pour le bruit que vous pouvez écouter autour de moi. Nous sommes sur le terrain.
We are outside, and we are actually right there responding to a humanitarian crisis. I am the coordinator for the COSAMED, and we are focusing on the medical academy and the social society at the RDC, and we are in the north of Kivu right now, and we are responding to the cholera pandemic that's happening. Epidemic, excuse me, that's happening right now. My question is very simple. I would like to know, how is this fund, how will the organization in the social societies will be implicated in that, will be involved in it? How will they benefit from it, and how will they be able to respond? I know that they are already present as far as representative, but how will it be when we start like implementing it? And I see that the United Nations are more involved, but what about the ones that don't have a partnership with those organizations? How are they going to benefit from it? Because the civil society do not have the resources, sufficient resource to respond, and that is that's a problem. And my other question and last one is, when there will be a call, who will be submitting it? Is it the government that will do it, or is it going to be the agencies that are eligible that will be submitting? So thank you, and go ahead.
Yeah, I think we can answer the question directly. Rafa or Courtney, would you like to answer the question? The first one is how the CSO will be benefit and involved in the pandemic fund, particularly on the implementation level, especially if they are not related to the implementing entities. And the second one is when will be the call for the proposals, and how will the submission process will be. So yeah, Rafa or Courtney?
Yeah, I mean, I can start, and Courtney, please feel free to add if I'm missing anything. Elia, I think your question is very much on point, and it's one of the concerns that civil society representatives of the fund have kept in mind during this process. Right now, the pandemic fund will work with a set of implementing agencies. These are some United Nations agencies, multilateral development banks, and other entities such as the Global Fund, Gavi, and CEPI. And they will be working with governments, or I would say the opposite, like national governments will be working with the implementing agencies in developing the plans, the proposals that they would like to submit to the fund. And civil society representative at the board has been very vocal and explicit that it is crucial that there is civil society engagement during the development and preparation of these proposals, and that it should be also something that is taken into account for assessing the value of those proposals that will end up being funded by the pandemic fund. So I think on our side, we are being very clear that it's important that national governments plan in advance how they're going to engage communities and civil society organizations at the local level, especially to have these proposals ready, and that in the end, that increases, of course, the likelihood of success of being proposals that really improve the pandemic preparedness capabilities of countries and communities. And so we hope that we can share with you more information on that in the coming weeks, as we have more information exactly on how it will be the first call for proposals. And that makes me, I'll address what we know so far, is that by later this week or next one, there will be a launch of expression of interest. Countries will be invited to raise their hand and say, I am interested in accessing funds from the pandemic fund. And they will be invited to get more familiar with the pandemic fund and the process that will be eventually launched, that right now is expected to be launched formally in March, for them to submit proposals. We know that, I mean, this information is still preliminary, but we know that, as I said, the expression of interest is being launched in February at the very first days. And then the first call for proposals will formally launch in March, and it will be, countries will have until May to prepare their funding proposals for approval. So then some of the other questions that I saw in the chat, if it's grants or loans, we know that these will be grants, but there's also a co-financing policy. So there are, like the pandemic fund is also looking to find ways to maximize the impact of their grants, to know how additional resources could be paired with the grants that will come from the pandemic fund in order to have very robust proposals. I don't know if I'm missing something else, or Courtney, if you would like to add something.
Nothing to add. Thanks, Rafa. That's great. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Rafa, for answering. Nina, please.
Yes, thank you, Olivia. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentation and information. I'm Nina Jamal from 4Pause International. Our focus is more on the prevention part, so deep prevention of root causes of pandemics. And you had kindly mentioned the expression of interest. So this means one way we can help governments is by encouraging them to express interest for certain areas of projects, right, in March before the official process begins. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, that is correct. And we very much encourage you to reach out to those contacts in national governments to express interest, because that will give them access to information for them to start preparing, to thinking what could be funded. And of course, the prevention part is also something that has come up. The One Health approach is something that is part of the discussions. And of course, the scope of the first call for proposals is still being defined. We know that there's emphasis on prevention, but also a lot of emphasis is as well on the implementation of the IHR, the international health regulations. So it will be a mix of those, but I think definitely encourage governments to sign up for or express their interest. And that also it's a good way for civil society to be from the very beginning in this process.
Yeah, hope that answers. And there's one question in the chat box from Annie M. Sosa. Would you like to turn on your camera and microphone and ask the question?
Sure. So thank you everyone for this opportunity and for explaining everything to do with the pandemic fund. My name is Annie Sosa. I work for WaterAid as advocacy advisor on health. I wanted to understand from those that are engaging within the board or other platforms, this arrangement of using implementing agencies, is it expected that this will be the status quo for the fund, or will there be opportunities in the future to actually provide direct budgetary support to governments?
Yeah, Rafa, please, or Courtney later.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. My understanding, and I'm also looking to the colleagues on the call, but I think that is the route they're going at the moment, that it will sort of require those sort of implementing agencies for that to be the way that the kind of funding goes. And that's, yeah, that will require sort of governments working with those agencies, also looking at the kind of like co-financing piece. But my understanding, and I'm looking at colleagues on the call who may have further information, but that is the kind of the route that they're going at the minute. And we haven't heard any information about whether there will be any opportunities that to go directly to governments. I think there's also a question around sort of who the implementing entities are. I know sort of some of them are kind of at the very beginning because they're very much sort of World Bank kind of hosted, or looking at kind of development banks. And I know there's been some expansion around sort of Gavi, CEPI, Global Fund, who have been sort of additionally included. Obviously, that doesn't obviously then mean that the money will go direct to governments. That still requires the implementing entities to be involved. And so I think that will be also something that we monitor, both as you're mentioning, right, whether that will change, but also who those implementing entities are, who are sort of selected to work with governments and how that's kind of decided as well. But Rafa, I don't know if you have anything to add on that. Thanks.
I think that's very much clear. That's what we know, that it's the path that it will be followed, at least in the coming months and probably a couple of years, while the fund continues to cement its work and its structure, its operations. It will be through implementing agencies. And we know that the list could also be expanded to include other organizations that have also like a lot of experience on fields that are relevant for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response.
Yeah, thanks, Rafa and Courtney. Anyone else have any questions or you want to share about the process happening in your country, or thoughts and comments about the pandemic fund? Please feel free to raise your hand. And Rafa and Courtney have shared some materials as well that you can access in the chat box. Yeah. Anyone else have any questions, comments? Yeah. Yeah, otherwise, I will hand back to Rosemary.
Olivia, thank you very much for this, and to all the colleagues for the questions that have come in. one of the things that I was thinking about, maybe in terms of a comment or a question, and I would look to either Courtney or Rafa, is in your presentation, Courtney, one of the things we were sharing here with colleagues is about how broader CSOs can input into the spaces where the 4 civil society and community representatives are. And we did mention about the 3 working groups. So we have the results framework working group, we have the core financing working group, and also the first call for proposals. Just checking in terms of how colleagues can input into those processes. You know, I know we have the regular town hall conversations, but maybe in which ways can colleagues continue to input into the conversations and into those spaces?
Thanks, Rosemary. Yeah, that's kind of like a key piece that we're kind of like developing as the support team. As you mentioned, Rosemary, we have sort of the town halls. And I think at the end of the call, we'll share details of the sort of next one that's coming up in a few weeks. And that's a great opportunity. Obviously, the interim board members provide updates on what's been happening, and it's very much sort of open discussion to ask any questions and to also, share any reflections or key priorities with board members that can then be taken forward. The second one is that we have the Google group, the kind of civil society community constituency mailing list. And we'll also, apologies, I'm sharing lots of links now in the chat, but we'll also share a sort of Google form where you can sign up to be added to that mailing list as well. And again, kind of key opportunities and updates will be shared, from town halls, minutes, details of the upcoming town halls, to where we also shared around this sort of briefing as well. But and that's kind of very much like information sharing, but also we can share our contact details, because obviously the organizations have come together to kind of create this informal support team to support the interim board members. And as we were saying and highlighted in the presentation, it's all moved very fast. And so obviously want to connect with as many colleagues as possible through those different mechanisms. So I think as we move towards the first call for proposals being launched, and I think there was a discussion yesterday also around the results framework, I think at the governing board, there might be a little bit of a kind of not restructuring, but a kind of like looking at whether which working groups are still active and what they look like, if they will be needed, or whether some of them will now close with the results framework, for example, I think being shared with the board members, but can definitely share contact details so you can reach out if you would like to sort of engage in those processes. We've kind of managed it for the working groups by sort of inviting colleagues to join, and again, another kind of Google form to express interest. For those kind of support teams, we've asked people to kind of sign, obviously, a confidentiality agreement, just because we're sharing board documents, as sort of happens within other sort of delegations at agencies, but just because, obviously we can't share those documents more broadly, but it's been a sort of open process for colleagues to identify themselves. And through that way, we share the documents open and invite colleagues to provide feedback, which we then kind of pull all together and share with the interim board members so that they can take it into their working groups or kind of board meetings as well. So we'll definitely put some contact details into the chat, and would also encourage colleagues who would be interested in working with us on what a permanent mechanism would look like. As I said, we're looking at sort of best practice across different agencies. We're looking at what lessons can be learned where things haven't gone so well in mechanisms, but it does require broad input with a lot of different perspectives of what that should look like. So please do reach out if you'd be interested in sort of engaging or inputting into those kind of spaces. And then finally, just to say, I think with the board reset, depending on what happens with this proposal for this kind of long-term mechanism, I think as we move towards May and the reset, I think obviously there will be a kind of rethink and a restructure, and maybe, a bit more of a kind of formal delegation or kind of engagement structure. And so we will obviously share any updates that come up around that, of ways that people can be more involved once those full-term reps are in post. Thanks.
Thank you, Courtney, for that and for helping us to reflect on that. And I know more of that will come when we go to the last slide. But I also, because you've talked about lessons learned, I think talking about lessons learned, one of the things we've learned, from the Act A platform is really about meaningful engagement, and not just of communities and civil society. I know we have covered that quite a bit. I think there's still more progress to be made on that end. But we also learned that from the Act A structure, especially right from the beginning, there wasn't a strong engagement or involvement of low and middle income countries in terms of government engagement in that platform. And I know in the external review of the Act A, one of the key highlights or key recommendations with future mechanisms like this is that there's more and meaningful involvement of low and middle income countries. And I think that will matter a lot, especially when it comes to the proposals, to the accountability at country level, et cetera, et cetera. And as Courtney, you are going through the fund governance structure, that slide, and I know we'll be sharing these slides. I see that, there are a number of countries there. Like you talked about Rwanda, you talked about Senegal, there's DRC, we talked about Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia. There are a number of low and middle income countries there that have access to the governance, to the board. And so I think that question, especially for those of us who are in low and middle income countries, I think there's a way to actually also reach out to those low and middle income countries that sit on the board. I think also utilizing that mechanism, first of all, to encourage them to be more vocal when it comes to engagement at the board, but also to see what kind of messages, what kind of priorities, what kind of conversations are taken to the board. So I think that will also be extremely important for us. And I know there is a question that has come up. Olivia, I know we are done with that, but I think there's a colleague who has come now. And so I think maybe, Olivia, you can take that before, so we don't close out anyone.
Yeah, so there's one more question from Tasha. Would you like to ask the question and turn on your camera?
Thanks. I was wondering what you see as the role for either international NGOs or local NGOs who bring technical experience in pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. Will they be considered implementing entities, or how do you see them playing a role in this fund, and will they be eligible to receive funding?
Thanks for the question, Tasha. Maybe Rafa, could you please answer the question first, and then Courtney can add later.
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Olivia. So, I mean, what we know so far is that it's about national governments and implementing agencies to prepare these proposals. Right now, the role of international or local civil society groups is to become engaged and present in those national spaces. So I think the focus right now of us as civil society organizations is to go and knock the door of governments and make sure that they know that we are there, that we want to be present. And on our side, for organizations that we're working on this global level, closer to the Pandemic Fund Board, our job is to make sure that civil society engagement will be something that it's very much desirable, and if not, of course, ideally, something that should be mandatory as part of the process to develop these proposals. Right now, we cannot tell exactly how this is going to be exactly, but it's something that we're pushing for, and we would expect that later at some point, depending on how the fund progresses, that it gets more funding, that we start also to seeing the results, where are like the opportunities for improvement, that the list of organizations that could become implementing partners could also grow based on the technical needs of the fund, of the capabilities that we need to improve on pandemic preparedness, prevention, preparedness, and response, and that list of implementing agencies is expanded to make sure that those with technical skills, with the knowledge, with the experience, are there and are working closely with governments to improve pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response.
Thanks, Rafa. Would you like to add anything, Courtney?
I think Rafa's covered it. Thanks. Yeah, I think as Rafa's already highlighted, I think there's that sort of like governance piece, and where like we look towards a more permanent mechanism, having sort of local, regional, national sort of civil society engaged from a technical perspective to input into the board discussions. But as Rafa's saying, also around the kind of operationalization of the kind of fund and the kind of projects in country, I think is something that will also be something that we kind of monitor in terms of what that looks like long term and how that's expanded. And also, I guess also like being clear from a civil society perspective, what we expect of governments and implementing agencies in developing those proposals. You know, I mentioned it briefly in the presentation around like, you know, the need for like civil society, like multi-stakeholder engagement, but I think also an important space to be engaged in those governments when they are developing those proposals on both thematic priorities, but actually how should they be working with civil society and communities and pulling those together, and to identify what the kind of key priorities are as well. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Courtney, at the proposal development stage, but also at the implementation stage at the country level. So I think there are governance pieces, there's how communities and civil society are engaged in the decision-making processes at the country level. But because there is also a results framework that we also have to hold ourselves accountable to, all the implementing governments and agencies accountable, I think there is a lot of connection to social participation, engagement at the country level, social accountability. And I think that will really be critical in terms of how we organize ourselves at the country level, especially. And I think really having a global movement that also supports like really strong civil society and community engagement at the country level, even though it's country-led, and that communities and civil society at the country level will organize themselves. But I think that global support, that global movement that is looking at that meaningful engagement, social participation, social accountability will be very important for our overall and collective gain in terms of impact of this. So I don't know if we have any other questions, or we can move to the last slide, which is pretty much around next steps. And already in the chat, we have highlights of, I think, how to join the constituency mailing list, how to stay engaged. There is a mailing list there, and Courtney has already put in something there. And Rafa has also shared with us the board composition, and also actually confirming that there are 9 seats for LMIC's representatives. So very important for us to take a look at that and see which countries those are and how we can engage with those. And then Olivia, thank you so much for the key important dates in terms of expression of interest, the first call and final selections, they're all in the chat. So how do we stay engaged as civil society? We did mention about the town hall meetings. Most of you have participated in those. And so the next town hall meeting is going to be on Thursday, February 16, and the times are listed there. And then there's going to be a civil society and communities. There is a civil society and communities constituency mailing list, and it's there in the chat. If you're not listed there, kindly, you are welcome to join. And if you have any feedback for us as organizers, if you have any feedback or thoughts, maybe of how we can better organize ourselves, or what town halls could focus on, or any feedback, there is an email address there where you can use to reach us. Kindly also feel free to visit the Pandemic Fund website. It has a lot of this information already listed there. You can engage with that, as well as the Pandemic Fund Action website. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank the support team for helping us have this and respond to the questions, and to all colleagues who have joined. Thank you for your engagement. We look forward to seeing you in future conversations. There is another Pandemic Fund 101 later this afternoon, and because of time zones. So encourage colleagues to join that. And we look forward to seeing you in the next town hall and in future conversations. I want to thank you very much and have a lovely day further.
Thanks, Rosemary. Thanks, everyone.